In the first reading, it is pretty apparent that God has a branding issue and needs to rebrand what it is that his teachings, and essentially, he says, God comes through the prophet Ezekiel in the first reading, and he puts to the people of Israel, he says that question, is it my ways that are unfair, or are your ways unfair? Right? And he goes through and kind of addresses that and talks about how, look, my way, I provide paths back to my mercy. And so the choice lies with each of us as human beings, not with, it's not that God is being unfair. God has to make his case and defend himself and sort of rebrand and remind those his followers that his ways are actually merciful and just and good. And I think what we see in that is that God needed to do this through the prophet Ezekiel because it had become sort of fashionable to believe the opposite. To believe, and it had become the situation where God's laws and teachings had begun to be branded as unreasonable, unmerciful, unjust. And so God sends his prophet Ezekiel and kind of says, look, my ways are fair and merciful and infinitely good, right? And so God goes through a sort of rebranding of his teachings and his mercy. And I think in our own day, we constantly have to kind of do that as well. There is a spirit of the world, an adversary of Christ that will always seek to rebrand and in fact, brand the church as burdensome, right? As just a big apparatus, something not in the Scriptures, something that was created by mankind, right? A sort of coping mechanism that we made to deal with the harshness of life, and so we needed rules and regulations, so we all got around and got together and invented the church and added it on top of the Scriptures, or maybe we made all of it up, right? But the world and people who are against the work of God in the world are branding the church and have been branding the church and her teachings that way for the 2,000-year history of the church, just as the teachings of God in the Old Testament to the Israelites were being branded that way as well. I'd like to just offer just a brief example or highlight of how that's not true. How just as God said through the prophet Ezekiel and reminded the people in the Old Testament, I think as well we have to rebrand and re-understand and cut through the clutter and the messaging about the church and get to the heart of the goodness and the reality of what God offers us in the church. And I want to just provide one example from last evening. At the parish at St. Paul's in Greencastle, we had a couple that got married during our evening Mass, which was really cool, right? Grant and Chrissy McAllister, Grant had gone through RCIA last year, the process that a person goes through to join the Catholic Church. Chrissy had been a cradle Catholic her whole life, but Grant, her husband, had gone through RCIA. But Grant needed an annulment. Grant had a previous marriage, and so awaited and went through the process of the church by which we look back at that first marriage and see, was that a valid marriage? Or could it be the case that we can say that because of extenuating circumstances or whatever it might be, that first bond of marriage didn't form, right? And so Grant went through RCIA, but did not receive word on his annulment being granted until just a few months ago. So Grant and Chrissy, because of that, had never had their marriage blessed in the church. They were married civilly, but had never had their marriage blessed in the church because of that prior marriage. So last night, at our 6 o'clock Mass in Greencastle, Grant and Chrissy both decided and sought out and went to the Sacrament of Reconciliation before Mass. And then Grant was confirmed after the homily, and then they both were married in the church after Grant's confirmation. And then Grant received First Communion that day too. So Grant had a big night last night. 3 sacraments at one Mass. Not bad. It's hard to top. I think you could maybe do 4. I'm not sure. I'd have to sit down. But 3, that's a pretty good night. Right? And it was great. Blessed to be able to celebrate with them. They had a big celebration down the street and kind of a wedding reception, so to speak. Even again, though they had been married civilly for about 25 years. In that little action, we see 3 things that a lot of times from the outside people would say, look at the Catholic Church and say, that is ridiculous, that is man's work, that is a bunch of bureaucracy, that is apparatus, that is a whole bunch of legal mumbo-jumbo that doesn't really matter, that's not of the gospel, it's just neurosis. The sacrament of confession is branded by many people from the outside as saying, who cares? It's not in the gospel. Why are you doing that? Just go see a psychoanalyst. And yet I know, from my experience as a priest in 8.5 years, I've never had one person say when they were done, I wish I hadn't gone through that. There are a lot of tears of joy and a lot of tears of healing in the sacrament of reconciliation. It is a beautiful sacrament. A beautiful gift from God. And I know because I go myself. I try to go monthly. It's branded one way, but it is completely the opposite in the lives of believers. The RCIA process that Grant went through, so many people look at that and say, oh my gosh, you have to go to class for 9 months to join the Catholic Church. Where's that in the gospel? Why don't you just take people in off the street, and if they want to get baptized, baptize them. If they want to join the church, have them fill out a form and be done with it. Where is any of these classes in the gospel? And yet I can tell you, walking through those classes as a priest with the people doing it, that last night, for Grant, he would say, I'm really glad I did that. I'm really glad I took the time to discern that. I'm really glad I took the time to listen to and think about, is this what I really want, before just being rushed into it. And then the annulment process. So many people, again, same thing. Bureaucracy, apparatus, why does the church care? Etc., etc., etc. You've heard it all. And yet I know for them and for countless others, because I work with all of the couples and people that are seeking or looking at annulments, that people will tell you after it's done, I needed that. I needed that time of discernment, of assistance, of having the church walk with me, to look at that first marriage, to go in there, and when the church comes back and says, yes, there were things, if the church comes back and says, yes, there were things that didn't allow that first bond to form, people will say, when it's all over, I'm glad I did that. A lot of times there are tears of healing, and so forth. And then finally, the idea that the church, that the marriage is blessed in the church. Chrissy and Grant had been married for 20 plus years civilly, beautiful children. They loved each other. Their marriage was one of that they both worked very hard and continued to love each other throughout that time. And yet both of them were emotional before the vows, during the vows themselves, and afterwards as well. Chrissy told me, I never thought I would have my marriage blessed in the church, with tears of joy. And so again, when we think about these kinds of things, I think we have to recognize that there is a force in the world that seeks to brand Christ, to brand God, to brand the Church of Christ as completely out of touch with reality, fake, set up, a sham, etc., etc. We have to, first of all, continue to remind ourselves and then go out and remind others that in fact it is not that case. It is the opposite. That this church, the Catholic Church, is the way and the means that Christ has chosen to bring his mercy to all people. We pray that everyone may recognize that and may not fall for the lies and the false advertising that is put out there so often by the enemies of the church.